She walked into the Billionaire's charity gala with nothing but the truth and two children he claimed didn't exist. 3 years ago, Garrett Sullivan threw his pregnant wife into the snow and destroyed her life with a single lie. He became a billionaire. She became homeless. He got magazine covers. She got hospital bills she couldn't pay. But tonight, in front of 500 of Seattle's most powerful people and live cameras, Victoria Brennan is about to prove that the man they worship is a fraud. This is the true story of how a broken woman brought down an empire. If you believe the truth always finds a way, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us would you have stayed silent. Let's begin. The Space Needle glittered against the Seattle skyline like a promise about to break. Inside the rotating observatory deck, 500 of the city's most powerful people sipped champagne and pretended to care about charity. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across designer gowns and tailored suits. Every face gleamed with the confidence that comes from never having worried about money. At the center of it all stood Garrett Sullivan, 35 years old and king of the technology world. His company, Sullivan Tech, had just completed a $4.2 billion initial public offering. Forbes called him a visionary. The Seattle Times called him a humanitarian. His publicists called him perfect. "Ladies and gentlemen," Garrett said into the microphone, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey, "tonight we celebrate not just success, but responsibility. Sullivan Tech is proud to announce a $10 million pledge to Seattle Children's Hospital." The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. His fiancée, Amber, a blonde influencer with 2 million followers, gazed at him adoringly from the front row. Everything was choreographed. Everything was perfect. Then the main doors opened. The applause faltered. Heads turned. A woman walked through the entrance, and the room seemed to tilt on its axis. She was 28 but looked older, the way struggle ages people from the inside out. Her dark hair was pulled back simply. She wore a navy dress that cost maybe $50, but it was her eyes that made people stop talking. They held the kind of quiet certainty that comes from surviving what should have killed you. Behind her walked two children, a boy and a girl, 3 years old, holding her hands. They had Garrett's eyes, Garrett's chin, Garrett's exact shade of brown hair. A journalist stood up instinctively, camera ready. A tech investor whispered to his companion. A board member went pale, and Garrett Sullivan, the man who always had the right words, said nothing at all. The woman stopped 10 feet from the stage. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply looked at him with those devastating eyes and said, "Hello, Garrett, I believe you wanted to discuss responsibility." The room exploded in whispers, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand this moment, to feel its weight, we need to go back to when Victoria Brennan believed in love and justice and the idea that good people won in the end. Back to before she learned that sometimes the system is not broken. Sometimes it is working exactly as designed to protect men like Garrett Sullivan. This is the story of how she fell, and how she rose, and how she learned that the opposite of powerlessness is not revenge. It is truth. Let me take you back 3 years, to the night everything shattered. 3 years earlier, Victoria Brennan sat in the conference room of Sullivan Tech, 6 months pregnant and terrified. Around the oval table sat 8 board members, all men, all staring at her like she was something dirty. They had stepped in. "Miss Brennan," said the chief financial officer, a thin man named Lyle Grant, "can you explain these transactions?" He slid a folder across the table. Inside were bank statements showing $2.3 million transferred from Sullivan Tech accounts to offshore vendors. Every transaction bore her digital signature. Every one originated from her IP address. Victoria's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. "I have never seen these before. I did not authorize any of this." "Your signature says otherwise," Lyle said coldly. "Then someone forged it. Someone set me up." She looked at Garrett, sitting at the head of the table. They had been together for 2 years, engaged for 6 months. This was supposed to be their future, their company, their family. "Garrett, tell them I would never do this." Garrett looked at her with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. "Vic, I want to believe you, but the evidence is overwhelming." "Evidence can be fabricated. You know me." You know, I found accounting irregularities last month. I brought them to you privately. Her voice cracked. Is that what this is about? I was trying to protect the company? Or, Lyle interjected, you realized we were closing in on your embezzlement scheme and tried to deflect blame. That is insane, or Victoria stood, her pregnant belly bumping the table. I am carrying his child. Why would I sabotage our future? One of the board members cleared his throat. Miss Brennan, given the circumstances, we have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. Security will escort you out. The room tilted. Victoria grabbed the table for support. Garrett, please talk to them. You know me. He would not meet her eyes. I think it is best if you leave quietly. Victoria, for everyone's sake. Two security guards appeared in the doorway. The walk through the office felt eternal. Former colleagues stared from their desks. The receptionist looked away. When they reached the lobby, one of the guards handed her a box with her personal items, a coffee mug, a photo frame, a plant, the detritus of a life that had just ended. She stood on the sidewalk in the Seattle drizzle, 6 months pregnant, holding a cardboard box, watching the building where she had believed she belonged, rain mixed with tears on her face. Somewhere above, in his corner office, Garrett Sullivan was already forgetting her name. She did not know yet that the worst was still to come. That night, when she returned to the penthouse they shared overlooking Elliott Bay, she found her suitcases packed in the hallway, and Garrett waiting with divorce papers. Sign these, he said. No preamble, no apology. The prenup is clear. You get nothing. You have 48 hours to vacate. Garrett, I did not steal that money. Someone framed me. Please, just listen. I listened for 6 months while you wormed your way into my company, into my life. I will not let you destroy what I built. What about our baby? He smiled then, and it was the cruelest thing she had ever seen. Your baby, Victoria. My lawyers will require DNA proof, and even then we will see what a court says about a convicted embezzler's custody rights. I have not been convicted of anything. Yet, he opened the door. 48 hours. After that, I will have you removed for trespassing. The door closed. The lock clicked. And Victoria Brennan stood in the hallway of a building she could not afford, carrying a child whose father had just erased them both, holding a box of worthless memories. She had 48 hours to figure out how to survive. She had no job, no references, no savings. The prenup had been airtight, and in Seattle's tech community, Garrett Sullivan's word was law. No one would hire her now. No one would believe her. She was alone in a way that felt like drowning on dry land. But Victoria did not know yet what alone really meant. That lesson was still coming. It would arrive 2 months later, in a hospital room, with 2 premature babies fighting for their lives and a bill she could never pay. That was when she would learn that rock bottom has a basement. 2 months crawled by like years. Victoria lived in an extended stay motel in Renton, the kind of place where people did not ask questions because they did not want answers. The room smelled like mildew and defeat. $80 a night. She had enough savings for maybe 2 months if she ate nothing but ramen noodles and peanut butter. Job applications went nowhere. Every tech company in Seattle had heard the rumors. Embezzler, fraud, gold digger. Garrett's PR team had been thorough. Even retail jobs turned her down once they saw the gap in her resume. What were you doing for the last 6 months? I was pregnant. And before that, I worked at Sullivan Tech. Oh, huh. That single syllable contained worlds of judgment. We will call you if something opens up. No one ever called. At 8 months pregnant, on a Tuesday morning in November, Victoria woke to pain that split her in half. Contractions, too early, too fast. She called 911 from the motel bathroom floor. Phone clutched in shaking hands. The ambulance ride blurred. Emergency room, strangers in scrubs. Someone asking about insurance. Someone asking about the father. I do not know where he is, she whispered through clenched teeth. It was easier than explaining. We need consent for emergency cesarean section. The babies are in distress. Babies? Plural. She had known about the twins for months, but hearing it now in this sterile room with fluorescent lights burning her eyes made it real in a way nothing else had. Do it, Save them, please. The operating room was cold. Someone counted backwards from 10. Victoria made it to 7 before the world went black. She woke to the sound of crying. One baby. Just one. A nurse placed a tiny, wrinkled creature on her chest. This is your son, Jackson. 5 pounds, 3 ounces. He is breathing on his own. And the other one, the nurse's face went carefully neutral. Your daughter, Emma, 4 pounds, 1 ounce. She is in the NICU. Her heart is not functioning properly. She needs surgery. Victoria tried to sit up. Pain screamed through her abdomen. I need to see her. You need to recover. The doctor will explain everything. Dr. Helen York arrived an hour later. She was 48, with kind eyes and a tired smile. She had delivered thousands of babies and learned how to deliver bad news gently. Emma has a congenital heart defect. She needs valve replacement surgery within the next 72 hours. The procedure costs approximately $180,000. Do you have insurance? Victoria laughed. It came out as a sob. I lost my job. I lost everything. What about the father? Can he help with costs? He said they are not his children. He will not help. Dr. York sat down on the edge of the hospital bed. Okay, we will figure this out. Let me talk to the social worker about emergency Medicaid. In the meantime, Emma is stable. You focus on healing. But Victoria could not focus on anything except the image of her daughter in a plastic box, tubes running into her tiny body, fighting a battle she should not have to face alone. The hospital social worker brought paperwork, mountains of it, Medicaid applications, paternity affidavits, consent forms. Victoria signed everything with hands that shook. What happens if Medicaid does not cover it? She asked. The social worker, a young woman named Beth, hesitated. We will work with you on a payment plan. And if I cannot pay, let's not think about that yet. But Victoria had to think about it, because thinking about it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. She called Garrett from the hospital landline. His assistant answered, Mr. Sullivan is not available. Tell him his daughter needs heart surgery. Tell him she will die without it. I will pass along the message. 3 hours later, a different lawyer arrived. Not Garrett, never Garrett, just his representative, a man in a gray suit carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than Victoria's entire motel wardrobe. Miss Brennan, Mr. Sullivan is prepared to offer a settlement. He will cover all medical expenses related to the birth and immediate care. In exchange, you will sign this non-disclosure agreement and relinquish all parental claims. Victoria stared at the document. He wants me to give up on children. He wants to ensure his privacy and protect his company from frivolous claims. These are his children. That has not been established. However, if you sign, the medical bills will be taken care of. If you refuse, you will be solely responsible for all costs. She thought about Emma in the NICU, about Jackson sleeping in the bassinet beside her bed, about the impossible math of survival. If I sign, he pays for Emma's surgery. Yes. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. I am not giving up my children, but I will sign the NDA. He can have his privacy. Just save my daughter. The lawyer smiled. A wise choice. She signed. He left. And Victoria allowed herself to believe, for 48 hours, that maybe the worst was over. She should have known better. 48 hours after signing. Victoria sat in the NICU beside Emma's incubator. The baby was so small. Wires and tubes made her look like a science experiment, but she was alive. The surgery was scheduled for the next morning. Dr. York approached, her face grave. Victoria, we have a problem. What kind of problem? The payment Mr. Sullivan's office promised was declined. His lawyer says there was a misunderstanding about the DNA test results. Victoria's blood went cold. What DNA test? Apparently his legal team ordered one without your knowledge. They used samples from the hospital records. The results came back showing only 32% probability of paternity. That is impossible. He is their father. Dr. York lowered her voice. Between you and me, something about this does not feel right. That percentage does not make sense genetically, but legally, his team is using it to void the payment agreement. So Emma's surgery is not covered. I am so sorry, Victoria. We can apply for emergency funding, but it takes time. Time we do not have. The world became very small. Just Victoria in the plastic box holding her dying daughter and the impossible weight of a choice no mother should have to make. What if I cannot pay? Dr. York looked away. The hospital will perform life-saving procedures regardless of payment. But after that, if you cannot demonstrate ability to care for the children, Child Protective Services will be involved. They will take my babies. I did not say that. But that is what happens. Silence where I am, which was answer enough. That night, Victoria had a breakdown in the hospital hallway. Security cameras caught everything. Her screaming, her sobbing, her collapse onto the linoleum floor. The footage would later be used against her in court as evidence of mental instability. But in that moment, she did not care about evidence or courts or anything except the fact that she had trusted Garrett's word. She had signed away her ability to speak publicly about him, and he had betrayed her anyway. The surgery happened because Dr. York pushed it through on emergency protocol. Emma survived. Barely. She would need follow-up procedures. More costs, more impossibilities. Victoria was discharged 3 days later with 2 newborns, no home, $347,000 in medical debt, and a social worker who looked at her with pity. Do you have somewhere to go? The social worker asked. A motel? Do you have family support? No. Employment? Not yet. The social worker wrote something on her clipboard. We will need to do a home visit within 2 weeks to ensure the children are in a safe environment. Victoria understood what she was really saying. Prove you can take care of them, or we will find someone who can. She took a taxi back to the motel with 2 infant car seats. The driver helped her carry them to her room. When she opened the door, she found an eviction notice taped to the wall. She was 3 days late on rent. She had to vacate immediately. She sat on the bed with a baby in each arm and laughed. Because crying had stopped working. Because the universe had become so absurdly cruel that laughter was the only response left. That night, she slept in the hospital family waiting room with the twins. A security guard found her at 3 in the morning. Ma'am, you cannot stay here. Where am I supposed to go? He looked uncomfortable. I do not make the rules, but if you are still here in an hour, I will have to call CPS. So Victoria walked at 3 in the morning with 2 newborns. She walked through downtown Seattle until she found a 24-hour diner. She ordered 1 cup of coffee and made it last until dawn. This was rock bottom. She thought, it has to be. But rock bottom is not a place. It is a process. And hers was just beginning. The article appeared in Seattle Tech Weekly 3 days later. Victoria saw it on a computer at the public library while searching for jobs. The headline made her stomach drop. Disgraced employee targets CEO with paternity trap. Below it, a photo of Garrett at a charity gala, looking powerful and wronged, and a smaller photo of Victoria, taken from her old company badge, looking guilty by proximity. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. It detailed her firing for embezzlement, her unproven claims about the twins, her erratic behavior at the hospital, complete with a still frame from the security footage showing her on the floor, face twisted in anguish. The comments section was worse. Gold digger got what she deserved. She planned this from the start. Poor guy, hope he sues her for defamation. Victoria closed the browser and walked to the bathroom. She locked herself in a stall and threw up everything in her stomach, which was not much. She had been eating 1 meal a day to save money for formula. Her phone rang, a number she did not recognize. Miss Brennan, this is Troy Mitchell. I am an investigative journalist with the Seattle Observer. I read the Tech Weekly piece. I would like to hear your side of the story. Why? Because I have been following Sullivan Tech for months, and something about their IPO numbers does not add up. I think you might be innocent. I think you might have evidence. Victoria hesitated. The NDA loomed in her mind. But Garrett had already painted her as a liar. What did she have left to lose? I will talk to you, but I need your help. My children are about to be taken away. They met at a coffee shop in Fremont. Troy was 34, with the kind of face that had seen too much and still believed in justice. He recorded their conversation and took notes and looked genuinely angry on her behalf. This is fraud, what he said after she finished. Corporate fraud, paternity fraud, Probably securities fraud if my suspicions are correct. I can write this. I can get your story out. Will it help me keep my children? It will expose him. That is a start. The article published 1 week later. It was thorough and well-researched and absolutely damning. Troy had dug up inconsistencies in Sullivan Tech's financial reports. He had found other women who claimed Garrett had a pattern of using and discarding employees. He had interviewed Victoria extensively and presented her as a victim, not a villain. For 48 hours, Victoria felt something like hope. Then Garrett's legal team struck back. They filed a defamation lawsuit against both Victoria and Troy. They provided emails, texts, and witness statements painting Victoria as obsessed and unstable. They released a statement calling the article a coordinated harassment campaign, and they filed for a restraining order. The hearing was brief. Garrett's lawyer presented the security footage, the Tech Weekly article, the new lawsuit. He argued that Victoria was engaging in a pattern of harassment that threatened his client's safety and business interests. Victoria's public defender, assigned because she could not afford a real lawyer, barely put up a fight. The judge granted the restraining order. Victoria was prohibited from contacting Garrett in any way, from mentioning him in public or online, from coming within 500 feet of any Sullivan Tech property. Violating the order was a criminal offense, jail time, and automatic grounds for losing custody. Victoria walked out of the courthouse into gray Seattle rain. Troy waited on the steps. "I am so sorry," he said. "I made it worse. You tried to help, but now you cannot even defend yourself." She looked at him with eyes that had learned what empty really meant. "I never could. The system was not designed for people like me." That night, she slept in a homeless shelter with the twins. The intake coordinator gave her a list of resources: housing assistance, food stamps, legal aid. Everything had a waiting list measured in months. Jackson cried from hunger. Emma's heart monitor beeped irregularly, and Victoria realized that survival was not about falling and getting back up. It was about falling and learning to crawl while the world stepped on your fingers. But even in that shelter, holding her children in a room that smelled like desperation, she made a decision. She would not fight Garrett publicly. She would not break the restraining order. She would go silent and survive and wait, because loud victims get destroyed, but quiet survivors sometimes get a second chance. She just had to live long enough to find it. 1 year passed like walking through mud. Every day identical. Every day impossible. Victoria worked 2 jobs. Barista at a corporate coffee chain from 5 in the morning until noon. Night security at an office building from 8 at night until 4 in the morning. Between shifts, she slept in 90-minute increments and took care of the twins. She never complained, never spoke about Garrett, never violated the restraining order, but she kept records. Every medical bill, every court document, every email from his lawyers. She stored them in a fireproof box under her bed in the tiny studio apartment. She finally scraped together enough money to rent. It was in White Center, the kind of neighborhood where people did not make eye contact. But it had a lock on the door and heat that mostly worked. The twins turned 1. Victoria baked them a cake from a box mix and sang "Happy Birthday" in a voice that cracked. They were thriving despite everything. Jackson was walking. Emma still needed medication for her heart, but she was strong, fighting. They had her eyes, her determination. She told herself that was enough. On a Tuesday in March, Victoria's phone rang during her coffee shop shift. An unknown number. She almost did not answer, but something made her pick up. "Victoria Brennan, yes. This is Paul Brennan, your father." She had not spoken to him in 10 years, not since he chose bourbon over his family and disappeared into the kind of life that left people hollow. "How did you get this number?" "I saw the article, the one from last year, about you and Garrett Sullivan. I have been trying to find you." "Well, you found me? What do you want?" Silence on the other end. Then, "I want to help." Victoria laughed bitterly. "You are 10 years too late." "I know, but I am sober now. 3 years, and I am a retired federal auditor. I worked for the Securities and Exchange Commission for 25 years before I lost it all. I still have connections. And if what that journalist wrote is true, Garrett Sullivan is running a fraud that I know how to prove." "Why do you care?" "Because I was not there for you, but maybe I can be there for my grandchildren." Victoria wanted to hang up. wanted to tell him to disappear back into whatever bottle he crawled out of. But desperation makes you take chances you should not take. What kind of help? Let me see the company's financial records. Everything you have, I will audit them quietly. No publicity, no restraining order violations, just the truth. And then what? Then we take it to the FBI. Victoria looked around the coffee shop, at people ordering lattes without checking their bank accounts first, at the world that kept spinning while hers stood still. Okay, Ma, she said, but if you disappear on me again, we are done, forever. I will not disappear. He did not. Paul Brennan showed up at her apartment 3 days later with a briefcase and 2 decades of federal experience. He looked older than she remembered. Gray hair, lined face, but his eyes were clear. He met the twins. Jackson climbed into his lap immediately. Emma watched him suspiciously until he made her laugh with a silly face. Victoria felt something crack in her chest. Something that might have been forgiveness, or might have been hope, or might have been the beginning of healing. Show me everything, Paul said. She did. He spent 6 weeks analyzing documents, making calls to old colleagues, and building a case that was meticulous and damning. He stole $18 million, Paul said finally. Moved it through shell companies before the IPO. He needed a scapegoat to cover his tracks. You were convenient. Can you prove it? With more time and access, yes, but we need someone inside the company, someone who knows where the real records are kept. Everyone there thinks I am a criminal. No one will help me. Paul smiled grimly. People surprise you sometimes. Let me make some calls. 3 days later, Victoria got an email from an address she recognized. Maya Price, her former colleague, her friend, before the accusation made friendship impossible. The email was brief. I know what he did to you. I have access to the server backups. Tell me what you need. Victoria stared at the screen. This was a risk. If Garrett found out, Maya would be destroyed the same way Victoria had been. But without inside help, the truth stayed buried. She typed back, "Are you sure?" Maya's response came immediately. "I have been sure for 2 years. I just did not know how to help until now." Over the next 4 months, Maya secretly copied files and sent them through encrypted channels. Paul analyzed everything, building a federal case brick by brick. Victoria kept working her jobs, raising her children, and staying invisible. Garrett Sullivan, meanwhile, was everywhere. Magazine covers, TED Talks, charity galas. He was engaged to Amber, an influencer who posted their perfect life to millions of followers. They were planning a televised wedding. Victoria watched from the shadows and waited, because justice is not fast, it is not loud. Sometimes it is just patient people collecting evidence while the world celebrates monsters. The FBI contacted Paul in August. They had reviewed his submission. They were interested, but they needed one more thing: Victoria's testimony under oath. They want to depose you, Paul explained over coffee in her tiny kitchen. The twins were at a neighbor's apartment, playing with kids their age. A rare hour of quiet. Ask questions about your time at Sullivan Tech, what you saw, what you reported. They need your account on record. Victoria's hands wrapped around her mug, seeking warmth that wasn't there. Garrett will be there. Probably. His lawyers will definitely be there. What about the restraining order? Court-mandated testimony is exempt. He cannot block it. The judge already signed off. Victoria stared into her coffee. 2 years. She had not been in the same room as Garrett Sullivan for 2 years. She had built a life around his absence, structured her days to avoid even thinking his name. And now the law was going to put them face to face across a conference table. I have not seen him in 2 years, she said quietly. Paul reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His fingers were rough, weathered by years of holding bottles and then years of holding on to sobriety. You do not have to do this, but without your testimony, the case is weaker. They can prove financial fraud, but the human cost, the retaliation, the abuse of power, that comes from you. She thought about the twins, about Jackson asking why they didn't have a daddy like other kids, about Emma's surgical scars, thin white lines across her tiny chest, about all the nights she had cried in the shower so her children would not hear, about the mothers who would come after her if Garrett walked away clean. When is the deposition? Next week. Thursday at 10 in the morning, Victoria's laugh was bitter. Of course, the same week as his charity gala? I checked. The gala is Saturday night, and the timing is not coincidental. His legal team probably thinks you will be too intimidated to show up at the gala after being grilled in a deposition. They are probably right. Paul squeezed her hand. You are the bravest person I know. I am not brave. I am just tired of being afraid. The next 6 days moved like walking through concrete. Victoria practiced her answers with Paul, reviewed documents until her eyes burned, tried on 3 different outfits before settling on a simple gray dress from Goodwill and black flats that did not pinch. She looked at herself in the mirror the morning of the deposition and barely recognized the woman staring back. 2 years of survival had carved away everything soft. What remained was lean and hard and unbreakable, or at least good at pretending to be. The deposition took place in a glass tower downtown, the kind of building Victoria used to work in when she believed the world was fair. The conference room was on the 14th floor with views of Elliott Bay, expensive art on the walls, a table that could seat 20. Garrett was already there when she arrived. He stood by the windows, phone to his ear, laughing at something. He wore Armani, charcoal gray with a pale blue tie. His hair was styled perfectly. He looked like success, like a man who had never doubted himself for a single moment. When Victoria walked in, he turned. Their eyes met. His went cold immediately, calculating. The same look he had given her the night he served divorce papers, the look that said she was a problem to be solved, not a person to be acknowledged. Victoria felt something crack in her chest. Not breaking, hardening, like clay in a kiln. She sat down at the far end of the table. Her public defender, a young man named Marcus who meant well but was clearly outmatched, sat beside her. Across from them were 3 of Garrett's lawyers. Expensive suits, sharper eyes. At the head of the table sat a federal prosecutor, a stern woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Jennifer Walsh. She had seen 1,000 depositions and knew which ones mattered. Let us begin, she said. Miss Brennan, please state your full name for the record. Victoria Ann Brennan, and your relationship to Garrett Sullivan. I was his employee and his fiancée. I am the mother of his children. One of Garrett's lawyers, an older man with silver hair, leaned forward. Objection. Paternity has not been established. Victoria pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. DNA test results. Court certified, 99.97% match. Would you like me to also provide the birth certificates where he signed as the father, or the hospital records from when he visited the NICU? The lawyer's jaw tightened. We will review these documents. The questions went on for hours. Victoria answered each one carefully, truthfully. Yes, she had been a compliance officer. Yes, she had discovered financial irregularities in March of that year. Yes, she had reported them directly to Garrett Sullivan in a private meeting in his office. What was his response? Walsh asked. He told me I was stressed, that pregnancy hormones were making me paranoid. He suggested I take a leave of absence. Did you pause? No. I documented everything and submitted a formal report to the board. And then what happened? Victoria's voice remained steady. 2 days later, I was accused of embezzling $2.3 million. Evidence was presented showing transactions from my computer, using my login credentials to offshore accounts. I was fired and escorted from the building while 6 months pregnant. Garrett's lawyer jumped in. Miss Brennan, is it not true that you had access to those accounts as part of your job? I had read only access for auditing purposes. I could not authorize transfers. But someone with your credentials could? Yes, if they had my password, which I never shared, but which was stored in the company's admin system, a system that Garrett, as CEO, had full access to. The room went quiet. Garrett shifted in his seat. The questions continued. Medical bills, the NDA she had signed, the falsified D test, her breakdown in the hospital corridor, every humiliation cataloged for the official record. During the lunch break, Garrett's lawyer stepped out. The prosecutor excused herself to make calls. Victoria sat alone in the conference room, eating a sandwich from a vending machine, staring at the Seattle skyline. She heard footsteps behind her, felt his presence before he spoke. This is pointless, Garrett said. Victoria did not turn around. Is it? You signed an NDA? You cannot prove anything. The FBI seems to think otherwise. He moved closer. She could smell his cologne, the same expensive scent he had worn when they were together. It made her stomach turn. Even if they investigate, he said, voice low and cold. Even if they find irregularities. I have lawyers who cost more per hour than you made in a year. This will drag on for years. You will spend what little money you have fighting a battle you cannot win. And in the end, I will still be standing, and you will still be nothing. Victoria turned slowly to face him. You are right about one thing. I was nothing. No money, no power, no connections. Just a woman with 2 babies and the truth. And you know what I learned. Garrett, I think I has nothing left to lose. And that makes me more dangerous than you ever imagined. His smile faltered. Just for a second. Just long enough for her to see the fear underneath. She pulled out her phone, opened the voice recorder app. Hit stop. Washington is a one-party consent state, she said quietly, which means I can record conversations without telling you. And you just admitted to knowing about the financial irregularities. You just confirmed that you knew I was pregnant when you had me fired. You just threatened me with legal retaliation for telling the truth. All on tape. The color drained from his face. See you at your gala. Garrett. She walked past him, leaving her half-eaten sandwich on the table. Behind her, she heard him fumbling for his phone, calling his lawyer, voice rising in panic. She smiled. For the first time in 2 years, she smiled. The afternoon session was brief. The prosecutor had what she needed. The deposition was adjourned. Victoria signed the final documents and walked out into Seattle's sunshine. Troy Mitchell was waiting on the sidewalk, leaning against his beat-up Honda. How did it go, he asked. Victoria handed him her phone. Listen to this. He did. His eyes widened. Holy shit. This is admissible. One-party consent. He had no expectation of privacy in a semi-public space during a legal proceeding break. My lawyer confirmed. Troy grinned. You are terrifying. You know that, I am learning. They walked to a nearby coffee shop. Victoria ordered tea she could not afford. Troy paid without asking. They sat by the window watching people rush past, living lives uncomplicated by legal warfare. The gala is in 3 days, Troy said. What are you thinking? Victoria stared into her tea. I am thinking that Garrett Sullivan has spent 2 years telling the world I am crazy, unstable, a liar. And I have been silent because the court ordered me to be. But that order expires the moment I walk into a public event. You are going with my children and my father. And you'd, if you are willing. Troy leaned back, studying her. This is not just about you anymore, is it? It never was. It is about every woman who gets destroyed for telling the truth. Every mother who loses her children because she could not afford to fight. Every person who thinks the system is too broken to challenge. And if this backfires, if he spins it as harassment. Victoria smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had walked through fire and learned they were made of something that did not burn. Then at least I will have burned him on the way down. The Seattle Art Museum glittered like a promise kept to the wrong people. 500 guests in designer everything. A string quartet playing something by Mozart. And Garrett Sullivan at the center, announcing his $10 million charity pledge to cameras that broadcast live. Victoria Brennan stood in the museum lobby with her father, her children, and Troy Mitchell. She wore the same dress from the deposition. Emma and Jackson wore outfits from Target that she had saved 2 months to afford. They looked small and out of place and absolutely perfect. Are you ready? Paul asked. Victoria looked at her children. Jackson was holding a toy airplane. Emma was humming to herself. They were 3 years old and had no idea they were about to watch their mother destroy their father's empire on live television. No, Victoria said, but I am doing it anyway. They walked into the ballroom. The reaction was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Someone dropped a champagne flute. The crash echoed through the massive space. Garrett was on stage, mid-sentence about corporate responsibility. His eyes found Victoria in the crowd. His face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, anger, fear. He recovered quickly. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have an unexpected guest. Security, please escort these people out. 2 guards moved toward Victoria. Troy stepped forward. I am Troy Mitchell with the Seattle Observer. These people are my guests, and I believe Mr. Sullivan knows exactly who they are. The cameras swiveled. Garrett's publicist looked panicked. Amber, sitting in the front row, looked confused. Garrett, Amber said loudly. Who is that? Victoria spoke before he could. Her voice carried through the room, steady and clear. My name is Victoria Brennan. 3 years ago, I worked for Sullivan Tech. I was engaged to Garrett Sullivan, and I was 6 months pregnant with his children when he had me fired and thrown out of our home. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras zoomed in on the twins. The resemblance was undeniable. Same eyes, same hair, same chin. That is a lie, Garrett said into the microphone. She is disturbed. She has a restraining order. I am calling the police. By all means, call them, Victoria said, because I would very much like to file charges for paternity fraud. Troy stepped onto the stage, projector remote in hand. With Mr. Sullivan's permission, I would like to share some documents, DNA test results. For instance, the real ones, not the fabricated test his lawyers used to avoid paying for his daughter's life-saving surgery. He clicked. The screen behind Garrett lit up with medical documents. DNA match probability, 99.97%. More gasps. Someone in the audience said, "Oh my God." Troy clicked again. And here are financial records from Sullivan Tech. $18 million in unauthorized transfers. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands. All authorized by Garrett Sullivan's personal login. The room erupted. Reporters surged forward. Board members looked at each other in horror. Amber stood up, tears running down her perfect makeup. You have children, she screamed. You told me she was crazy. You said she made it all up. Amber, please, let me explain. Explain that you are a liar, that you let your daughter almost die to protect your reputation. She ripped the engagement ring off her finger and threw it at him. It bounced off his chest and clattered onto the stage. The main doors opened. 4 people in FBI windbreakers walked in. Paul had made the call 2 hours earlier. They had been waiting for the right moment. The lead agent approached the stage. Garrett Sullivan, you are under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Garrett tried to run, like a character in a bad movie. 2 agents grabbed him before he made it 3 steps. The handcuffs clicked. The cameras flashed. And Victoria Brennan watched the man who had destroyed her life get led away in restraints, while 500 of Seattle's most powerful people watched in stunned silence. Troy turned to the cameras. This story will be available in full tomorrow morning. It is about corporate fraud, abuse of power, and one woman's 2-year fight to protect her children and expose the truth. He looked at Victoria. She stepped forward, Emma on her hip, Jackson holding her hand. I am not here for revenge, she said. Her voice shook but held. I am here because women like me are told to be silent. We are told no one will believe us. We are told that powerful men are untouchable. But I am standing here with my children and the truth. And I want every woman who has been silenced to know that the system may be broken. But your voice is not. The room was completely silent. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone started clapping. Then another person. Then another. Within seconds, half the room was applauding. The other half was calling lawyers. Victoria walked out of the museum the same way she walked in, quietly, with her family, leaving behind a man who had once seemed invincible, now facing 12 years in federal prison. Outside, Seattle rain was falling. It felt like baptism. 6 months later, Victoria sat in a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, watching rain slide down the windows. The shop was called Second Chances. She liked the irony. Garrett Sullivan had taken a plea deal. 12 years in federal prison, no parole for at least 8. He had tried to fight it initially, spent millions on lawyers who promised him freedom, but the evidence was overwhelming. 18 million in stolen funds, falsified DNA tests, corporate fraud spanning 5 years, wire fraud, obstruction of justice. The charges kept stacking until even his most expensive attorneys advised him to take the deal. Victoria had not attended the sentencing. She watched it on the news from her apartment, the twins playing with blocks at her feet, building towers and knocking them down with delighted shrieks. When the judge read the sentence, Victoria felt nothing, not satisfaction, not vindication, Just a quiet closing of a door that had been open too long. Sullivan Tech no longer existed. The company had been acquired by a competitor 3 months after Garrett's arrest. They had stripped his name from every building, every product, every press release. The new owners sent Victoria a formal apology letter and a settlement check that made her cry. Not because of the amount, though it was substantial, but because someone, finally, had said the words, "We are sorry." Amber had written a memoir. Behind the Billionaire, How I Fell for America's Most Dangerous Liar. It was currently #3 on the New York Times bestseller list. The first chapter opened with the moment at the gala when she learned about the twins. She had been generous to Victoria in the book, portraying her as a survivor rather than a villain. They had met for coffee once, two women connected by the same man's destruction. It was awkward and healing in equal measure. "I believed him," Amber had said, tears in her eyes. "I defended him to my family, to my followers. I feel like such a fool." "You were not a fool," Victoria had replied. "You were human. That is what he counted on." Amber donated all memoir proceeds to organizations fighting corporate fraud and supporting single mothers. She had lost her influencer career in the scandal, but gained something else. Purpose, maybe, or just peace. Maya Price, the colleague who had risked everything to provide evidence, had been fired from Sullivan Tech the day after Garrett's arrest. His remaining loyalists had made sure of that. But within a week, she received 4 job offers from competitors. She took the one that paid double her old salary and gave her the title of Senior Compliance Director. She and Victoria had coffee once a month now. They never talked about Garrett. They talked about their kids, their lives, their respective therapists, and the strange shape of survival. "I should have come forward sooner," Maya had said during their first coffee meeting. "You came forward when you could." Victoria had replied, "That is all any of us can do." Victoria's phone buzzed now, pulling her from memory. A text from Troy Mitchell. "Ted, Seattle confirmed. You are speaking next month. Topic: when the system protects abusers. Nervous." She typed back with one hand, her tea balanced in the other. Terrified, but doing it anyway. Troy had won a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative series on corporate fraud and retaliation. The series had used Victoria's case as a centerpiece, but expanded to document dozens of similar stories. Women fired for reporting harassment. Whistleblowers bankrupted by legal fees. The systematic way corporations weaponize the justice system against the vulnerable. His work had sparked congressional hearings. 3 senators were now pushing for federal whistleblower protection reforms. "You changed everything, you know?" Troy had told her last month over drinks. "Your story, it gave other people permission to speak. I did not do it alone." "No, but you went first. That is the hardest part." The coffee shop door opened, bringing in cold air and the sound of the city. Victoria's father walked in, holding the twins' hands. They were almost 4 now. Jackson wore a bright red jacket and light-up sneakers. Emma had insisted on wearing her princess dress under her raincoat, the tulle peeking out in defiant pink layers. "Grandpa bought us pancakes," Jackson announced proudly, climbing into the chair beside Victoria. "With chocolate chips," Emma added, settling into her own seat with the grave dignity of someone in formal wear. "And whipped cream. Grandpa said we could." Paul sat down across from Victoria with a sheepish grin. "They ate all of them, and possibly some of mine. And maybe I had coffee cake. I am a bad influence. You are supposed to be the responsible adult. I am 3 years sober and have full custody of my grandchildren every weekend. I coach Jackson's t-ball team. I attend Emma's ballet recitals. I am very responsible. The pancakes are my one vice." Victoria smiled. Her relationship with her father had been rebuilt slowly, carefully, like setting a broken bone. You had to line up all the pieces correctly, hold them still while they healed, except that there would be scars. It still ached sometimes, especially on Father's Day, or when she remembered all the years he had been absent. But it was healing, and healing was enough. "The nonprofit paperwork came through," Paul said, pulling out his phone to show her the official email. "Verified Truth Initiative is officially registered. You have your 501c3 status. The IRS approved everything." Victoria had used part of the restitution money to start an organization helping women in tech who faced retaliation for reporting fraud or harassment. The rest she had put in trust funds for the twins and donated to hospitals for families who could not afford NICU care. In 6 months, Verified Truth Initiative had taken on 42 cases, won 38. The 4 they lost were still in appeals. And the speaking requests, she asked, 12 so far this month. Paul scrolled through his phone, which he now used as her unofficial scheduling assistant. 3 universities want you for their Women in Leadership series, 2 legal conferences, 1 corporate ethics summit, a podcast with over 1 million listeners, and someone from the United Nations Commission on Women's Rights. The UN, they want you to speak about corporate retaliation and gender-based economic violence. Victoria felt dizzy. I am not sure I am ready to be a public figure. Paul looked at her seriously, the way he used to look at her when she was a child and he was still sober, still her father before the bottles took him. You already are. You just get to decide what kind. You can hide from it, or you can use it to help people who are where you were 2 years ago. Jackson tugged on her sleeve. Mama, can we go to the park? It stopped raining. She looked out the window. He was right. The rain had softened to mist, gray Seattle sky showing hints of blue. Yes, baby, let's go to the park. That night, after the twins were asleep in their room, Victoria stood in front of the mirror in her apartment. It was a real apartment now, in Fremont, with 2 bedrooms and a view of the canal. The rent was manageable. The walls were covered with the twins' drawings, rainbows and stick figures, and houses with too many windows and families with too many arms. She practiced her TED Talk for the 20th time. My name is Victoria Brennan. 3 years ago, I lost everything. My job, my home, my reputation. I was 6 months pregnant and suddenly homeless. I gave birth prematurely in an emergency cesarean section. My daughter almost died from a heart defect that required surgery I could not afford. I lived in shelters and survived on 1 meal a day so my children could eat. I was told to be silent, to accept that powerful men do not face consequences, to disappear quietly. She paused, looking at herself in the mirror, at the woman who had survived. But silence protects abusers, and I decided I would rather be loud than safe. It took 2 years of silence first, 2 years of collecting evidence, of building a case, of learning that justice is not fast or fair, but it is possible. It took help from people who believed me when the world said I was lying. It took patience and evidence and refusing to give up even when giving up felt like the only option left. She took a breath, steadying herself. They tried to bury me. They did not know I was a seed. The line had come to her one night while reading to the twins, a children's book about a garden, about things that grow in darkness, pushing through soil toward light, about how the hardest part of a seed's journey is the time spent underground, in the dark, when nothing visible is happening but everything important is. It felt true in a way nothing else had. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Miss Brennan, my name is Sarah Martinez. I was fired last week from my job for reporting financial fraud. I saw your story. I do not know what to do. Can you help? Victoria stared at the message. She thought about saying no, about protecting her peace, about all the reasons she could give for not taking on someone else's battle. Then she thought about the coffee shop, about the woman she had been 6 months ago, about the hand that had reached down to pull her up. She typed back, yes, come to my office tomorrow at 10. Bring all your documentation. You are not alone. She hit send and felt something shift. Not burden, responsibility, maybe, or purpose, or just the knowledge that survival was not the ending. It was the beginning of everything that came after. 1 year after the gala, Victoria received a package at her office. The office was small, just 3 rooms in a converted warehouse in Georgetown, but it was theirs. Verified Truth Initiative. The name painted on the door in clean, simple letters. The package had no return address. Inside was a model private jet, beautifully detailed, every window perfectly rendered, with a note tucked under one wing. You flew higher than he ever could. Proud of you, Architect Troy. Victoria put it on her desk, next to photos of the twins at the zoo and a framed copy of the Washington State Legislature Bill 2847, known publicly as Victoria's Law. The law criminalized the falsification of paternity tests and created stricter penalties for corporate retaliation against whistleblowers. The governor had invited her to the signing ceremony. She had stood behind him with the twins, cameras flashing, and felt something that might have been vindication, but felt more like grief. Grief for all the years this law did not exist, for all the women who had needed it before it came. That afternoon, she met with a young woman named Sarah Martinez, 26 years old, 8 months pregnant, just fired from a startup for reporting sexual harassment by the CFO. The pattern was familiar. The fear in her eyes was familiar. The way she apologized for taking up Victoria's time, as if survival required permission. "I do not know what to do," Sarah said, hands wrapped protectively around her belly. "No one believes me. He is powerful. I am nobody. And I am about to have a baby with no job and no insurance." Victoria reached across the desk and took her hand. "You are not nobody, and you are not alone. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." They talked for 2 hours. Sarah's story spilled out in fragments. The inappropriate comments that escalated to touching, her reports to HR that went nowhere, the sudden performance review claiming she was not meeting standards, despite 3 years of excellent evaluations, the firing that came 2 days after she filed a formal complaint, the company's lawyer who offered her 3 months severance if she signed an NDA and never spoke about it again. Victoria took notes, asked questions, and felt the old anger burning clean and purposeful. Not rage, strategy. "Here's what we are going to do," Victoria said. "First, you are not signing any NDA. Second, I am connecting you with 3 lawyers who work pro bono for the nonprofit. They specialize in pregnancy discrimination and retaliation cases. Third, we are going to document everything, every email, every text, every witness who saw what happened. And fourth, you are going to file a complaint with the EEOC and the State Civil Rights Commission. I cannot afford lawyers. You do not have to. That is why this organization exists." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you helping me? You do not even know me." Victoria thought about the question, about the hospital waiting room where she had slept with 2 newborns, about the moment she had decided to survive instead of disappear. "Because 3 years ago, I was you, and no one helped me until it was almost too late. I do not want that to be your story." By the end of the meeting, Sarah was crying with relief instead of fear. Victoria walked her to the door, watching her navigate the stairs with one hand on the railing, the other on her belly. "How did you do it?" Sarah called back from the landing. "How did you survive all of it?" Victoria leaned against the doorframe, considering. "I stopped trying to survive and started trying to live. I stopped waiting for justice and started building it. And I learned that power is not about money or status. It is about knowing your truth and refusing to let anyone take it from you. Even when they try, especially when they try." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. "Thank you for everything. Thank you for trusting me." After Sarah left, Victoria returned to her desk and opened her laptop. 53 unread emails, interview requests, speaking invitations, case files from women who had found her website. She answered them one by one, her coffee going cold beside her. At 6, she closed the laptop and drove to her father's house to pick up the twins. Paul had retired early from his consulting work to spend more time with them. His house had become their second home, filled with toys and books and the kind of chaos that comes from being deeply loved. Imama ran to her, tulle and glitter trailing behind her. "We made a fort and Grandpa said we could eat dinner inside it." "It is architecturally sound," Paul said, emerging from the living room where an impressive structure of couch cushions and blankets had been erected. "I checked the load-bearing pillows." Jackson poked his head out from inside the fort. "Can we sleep here tonight? Please." Victoria looked at her father. He shrugged with a smile that said, "Whatever you want." "Not tonight, buddy. School tomorrow. But maybe this weekend." They drove home through Seattle traffic, the twins chattering about their day. Grandpa had taught them to play checkers. They had fed ducks at the park. Mama Emma had decided she wanted to be a doctor. Jackson wanted to be an astronaut, or maybe a firefighter, or possibly both. Victoria listened to their voices and felt overwhelmed by the ordinary miracle of it. That they were here, that they were healthy, that they got to be children instead of casualties. Later, after dinner and baths and 3 stories and 2 glasses of water and one more hug, the twins finally slept. Victoria stood in their doorway watching them breathe. Jackson sprawled like a starfish. Emma curled tight like a fist. Both of them safe. Both of them hers. She walked to her balcony with a cup of tea and stood watching ferries cross Puget Sound. Lights reflected on dark water. The city hummed its endless song. Somewhere out there, Garrett sat in a federal prison. She wondered if he thought about them, if he regretted anything, if he had learned that the opposite of power is not weakness, but accountability. She hoped he had, but she did not need him to. His regret was not required for her peace. Her phone buzzed. A text from Troy. 47 women have come forward since your TED Talk went live. 47. Do you understand what you started? Victoria looked at the message for a long time. Then she looked at the city spread before her. At all the lights in all the windows, at all the stories happening simultaneously in the dark. She typed back, "We started it, all of us, every person who refused to stay silent." She thought about those 47 women, about Sarah, 8 months pregnant and terrified, about Maya, risking her career to provide evidence, about Amber, losing her public persona to tell the truth, about every person who had ever faced the choice between safety and honesty and chose the harder path. They were not victims. They were seeds, planted in darkness, growing toward light. Victoria Brennan had learned something important in the depths of her own darkness, that the opposite of powerlessness is not revenge. It is truth. And truth, once planted, grows in ways you cannot predict. It spreads through root systems you cannot see. It breaks through concrete. It turns deserts into forests. 3 years ago, she had been thrown into the cold with nothing. Today, she stood in warmth she had built herself, with children who knew they were loved, with work that mattered, with a father who showed up, with a community of survivors who had become warriors. The story of how she fell would matter to some people, but the story of how she rose and how she reached back to pull others up, that would matter to everyone. Victoria finished her tea and went inside. Tomorrow she would answer more emails, take more cases, give another interview, fight another battle. But tonight she simply stood in the doorway of her children's room and watched them sleep, watched their chests rise and fall, watched their dreams flicker behind closed eyelids. "We made it," she whispered to them. "We made it." And in the morning they would wake up and build towers from blocks. They would knock them down and build them again. They would learn, without knowing they were learning, that falling down is not the ending. Getting back up is. Emma stirred in her sleep, reaching for her brother's hand across the space between their beds. Their fingers found each other in the dark, holding on the way they had since before they were born, since they were curled together in Victoria's belly, 2 hearts beating beside hers. They had survived together, and they would thrive together. And somewhere years from now, they would tell their own stories, not about what was done to them, but about what they built despite it. Victoria turned off the light and closed the door softly. Outside, Seattle rain began to fall again, gentle this time, the kind that nourishes instead of punishes, the kind that makes things grow. Where are they now? Victoria Brennan is CEO of Verified Truth Initiative, which has helped over 500 women and influenced 12 state laws. She lives in Seattle with her children and continues to speak on corporate accountability and survivor advocacy. Garrett Sullivan is serving year 4 of a 12-year federal sentence. His request for early parole was denied. Paul Brennan celebrated 6 years of sobriety and is an active grandfather. He volunteers with the initiative's financial investigation team and coaches youth baseball. Troy Mitchell won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism. He is working on a book about corporate fraud and the whistleblowers who exposed it. Dr. Helen York continues to practice neonatal medicine in Seattle. She testified in favor of Victoria's law and serves on the board of Verified Truth Initiative. Emma and Jackson are healthy, happy 6-year-olds. They want to be astronauts when they grow up, or doctors, or possibly both.